Hi, Father Ian Van Heusen here. I'm here with Rob Agnelli. We're going to be talking about the 10 virtues of Mary, and we're going to be talking about angelic kindness. And I did have the idea on how I want to lead this off, is this whole relationship between Northerners and Southerners. So I've lived about half my life in the North, half in the South. Well, maybe now more in the South. So in the North, the reputation of Southerners in the North is that they're fake. So that they always pretend like they like you. Mm-hmm. They always pretend like they're friendly. And then the North, they're more authentic. And of course, the reputation Southerners have of the Northerners is that they're rude. And they just say what's on their mind. Well, you've lived.
Yeah, I've lived in both. I would I would lean towards the northern side only, and I think I always think it's kind to be direct to people.
Yeah,
be direct with people, but not to the point of telling them my problem that I have with them, right? Like that's
well, that's what we were kind of fleshing out before, right? Is that so you like that? So in a positive way, if we were putting a positive spin, Northerners are more direct, and so you're not left wondering what are they really thinking.
Yeah. But they don't need to know everything I'm thinking, right? Like,
they don't need to know everything I'm thinking or everything I'm experiencing, which we're going to flesh out in a second.
Yeah, because very often, my response to someone is really not about them anyway. It's really when I start making things about me, they're doing something that's annoying me, right? Yeah. I don't like how they get away with doing something that I wish I could get away, whatever, I don't really like that guy. He's just, he kind of, bugs me.
Exactly. And we were talking about that a little bit. One of the things when I'm advising people on communication, one of the strategies I use, I tell people, normally if you stick to nouns and verbs, you're normally fine. It's when you start throwing in adjectives, right? Mm-hmm. And then the point I'm getting at, and of course, the taking to extreme, that's not exactly what I mean. But the idea is so like if I were saying like, let's say you were talking with your wife, and your wife you didn't do the dishes, right? And your wife was like, honey, you didn't do the dishes, right? A good communication strategy would be, honey, you didn't do the dishes, and I was just wondering why that was, or whatever. Mm-hmm. Maybe even throwing in there, it really inconvenienced when I had to do them or whatever, or the food sat out all day or something like that. Where people get themselves a lot of times into trouble with communication is, honey, you didn't do the dishes, you're a lazy slob, right? And then now we've thrown in some adjectives, and now you've qualified, and now it's like, I perceive you as lazy slob, right?
Yeah, and that is really all about, now I'm picking on my wife, that's not my real wife, but it's now about her though, about what it did to her, rather than being directed towards me about simply just correcting me in some way, right? In a simple way. And so I think kindness, which is sort of what we're circling or hovering around here, is really putting yourself in the place of the other. Yeah. Right? Like 1 Corinthians chapter 13, like love is patient, love is kind. Yeah. Right? And what we often confuse, we think kindness is being nice. Yeah. Right? Which is, the sort of saccharine way in which Northerners might look at Southerners. Yeah. Right? They think, they're so nice. And there's always that undertone of fakeness with nice. Yeah. Right? Whereas kindness is something much deeper, right? Yeah. And Our Lady may not have been all that nice, but she was kind to an angelic degree. Yeah. And there's probably a certain sweetness to her personality as well. For sure. So, now, and I think what we were talking about before is we could break our experiences down into component parts, right? So the classical anthropology, the classical epistemology, anthropology, is that when I encounter something in the world, I encounter an object in the world. I encounter something. So for the wife, she encounters the dishes, that they're not done. That evokes in her a certain emotion, right? In that case, a negative emotion. Then she has a choice to make about what she's going to do based on what the emotion is. And what we were talking about, and this has really wrapped my mind around this idea of being kindness, as I posed to you the question, I was like, are we simply what our emotions tell us, or are we what we choose? Because the two can be somewhat distinct. They're not separate completely. So, let's say there's somebody I do not like.
like I experience negative emotions in their presence, that I'm either annoyed with them or they hurt my feelings. And then I choose to respond a certain way. Let's say I choose to respond by being patient and kind with them and speaking well of them to somebody else. Am I the emotion or am I the choice? Right? What exactly constitutes what I've decided? And of course it's the choice.
Yeah.
But think about that distinction, right? Because a lot of times people, they think it's fake. Like let's say I have somebody in my life who I have very negative emotions towards. But in a particular moment, I choose to speak well of them. Now, sometimes that can be fake. Sometimes that can be duplicitous. I think we could parse that out a little bit. But sometimes that can also be kindness, right?
Yeah, I think about just the idea. So the example that comes to mind is so we were at this event, and there's a person there that just is difficult to be around, and doesn't evoke a great response in me.
Yeah.
And normally he corners me. And
Yeah.
will talk to me for quite a while, right?
Yeah.
And so I saw him, and I went the other way around the room so that I didn't get cornered.
Yeah.
And my wife called me out on it immediately. She said, "I saw what you did." She's like, "I know why you did that."
Yeah.
And it was great that she did. And then lo and behold, the next time I go, again, he's there. And he's headed to corner me, and recalling, like, I let myself be cornered. Yeah. Because I put myself in his position, yeah. Right? And in the end, by what I did was kind, because it wasn't about like what he was causing in me. It became about him. Yeah. Right. Like, and Saint Therese has a beautiful little in her diary has a little thing about this one nun that really annoyed her. She would click her tongue. I don't know if you remember this. She'd click her tongue during. Like when they were supposed to be singing, and she just really annoyed her, right? And she would go out of her way to spend time with her. Yeah. You know, she would avoid her at first and then went out of her way, because it's one thing to avoid, I don't like walking through mud. It's another thing to avoid a person. Yeah. Right? And St. Therese knew it became about the other person and not about her. So kindness lets me essentially walk a mile in someone else's shoes, right? And sometimes, when I have to speak kindly about them, maybe that's not really what I feel, but as I begin to think differently about them, it becomes less unpleasant, right? And of course I'm going to think less, think differently when I begin to speak differently, right? Yeah. Yeah.
And it is a little tricky because the avoiding thing, because there's a few people avoiding.
Yeah, I mean, it's on one hand, again, it's natural, right? But I don't want to just be natural. I want to be supernatural, right?
Like, yeah, well, it would depend a little bit. I mean, because I was thinking about it. I mean, I would say there's one person that that's in my life that always, like, it's always uncomfortable being in their presence, in the sense that, like, just like always put me down and things like that.
Yeah, there's healthy boundaries too, right? Like,
exactly.
Yeah, for sure. Like, you don't set yourself up to be. Me spending 15 minutes cornered in a room full of people with this guy, like, is it like we're not even close to boundaries or abuse or anything like that? But certainly, like, people that are just plain unpleasant, like, in some respects, it's kind to avoid them because you're keeping them from doing something like sinning, right? You're keeping them from cutting you down.
But do you have any? There's a few people in my life that I can think of that I generally don't enjoy them.
Everyone that knows you now is trying to think about if they're them, by the way.
I guarantee.
I wonder if he's talking about me.
I guarantee this. Statistically, the people I'm talking about will never.
Okay, then we can just go on.
If you're listening to this, I guarantee you're not the person.
Wait, is Father Ian passively aggressively talking about me?
Well, and then I think that's part of the challenge of talking about these things. Is there's a few people in my life that I don't like very much, and I've had a lot of negative experiences with, but I can objectively say that they're a good person and that I would recommend them for certain things. Mm-hmm. Like, and that's kind of what I was getting at, right? It's just my relationship with them is not what it could be for whatever reason.
Yeah. Yeah, and
which is a little bit different.
And that happens, personalities clash, right? Like, we can't overlook that. We can't, just suddenly, St. Jerome pissed off a lot of people. Still a saint though, right?
Yeah. Well, he had his famous thing with Augustine where he said Augustine wasn't very bright.
Yeah.
I guess he was.
Like, I'm guessing he wasn't on Augustine's Christmas card list. Like, if I had to guess,
Well, what it was Augustine. He might have been right. I think Augustine didn't know, like, the original Hebrew of the Old Testament or something, and St. Jerome kind of called him out on it. But Yeah, they weren't friends after that. The illustrious Bishop of Hippo.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, but that, and I think it's not we are our choices, but I think there is something to be said for being authentic, which is, I mean, the classic, if we look at it, the stereotypical northerner on one extreme and the stereotypical southerner on the other extreme, like virtue is found within the middle of those two.
Yeah, but the authenticity comes like when you authentically love, right? So the fact that there's something wrong with me in my response to someone, I should never share that. That's not authentic at all, because I have an authentic, like, that's not who I really, like, God has called me to be. So I'm not fake. I'm not lying. Like, there is a little bit of in the virtuous life. There's a little bit of fake until you make it anyway, right? Yeah. Like where you don't feel like doing something, you're not fully on board with doing it, but you do it anyway, and then eventually it gets. But
that's the challenge, because a lot of young people, and I see this sometimes. I saw this in seminary a lot. A lot of young people, when they hear this idea of kindness, they do have this view that they should always be friendly. They should always be positive, that dealing with any negativity. Like, I'll give you an example. I was in seminary, a seminarian asked, well, why is this phenomenon happening in the church? And I laid out like 2 or 3 reasons. It was like, it could be this, it could be that, it could be that. But they're all kind of negative. Mm-hmm. They weren't very pious. They were negative. And I think in part I was right about it. And the seminarian was like, he was scandalized that there's evil in the church, or that there's people with bad motives. I'm like, I mean, come on, man. I mean, we don't have to, I'm not saying that we have to always think negatively of the church or our leaders. I mean, I would say in terms of corruption within the church, it's like a bell curve. There's some really bad corruption, there's some profound holiness, and a whole bunch of people in the middle, right?
Yeah.
On either end. But what I was struck by that is sometimes
it's probably like something like 1 to 10 to 1. I'm just saying, I was going to pick percentages. Judas is the example, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. Well, I talk about that the Judas Iscariot principle. 1/12 of the early bishops were corrupt.
Yeah.
So if you look at that, like 1/12 of the bishops worldwide are corrupt. I'm like, oh yeah, a lot of bad stuff's going to happen.
Yeah, and Jesus picked them.
Jesus picked them. Yeah. That was actually when the scandal came out. I started talking about that. People got mad. They're like, well, we can root out corruption. I'm like, hold up for a second. Time out. So if Jesus couldn't root out corruption, which is not even that he couldn't root out corruption, he chose not to, then what do you think we can fix the church?
Yeah, especially if you're not praying for conversion, right? Like, ultimately, right?
Even then, Jesus selected 12 and one was corrupt. He selected a corrupt person.
Yeah, and I think that just the understanding that if we have a proper understanding of kindness as me putting myself in the place of the other, then there are times when, like, it's kind to correct, it's kind to be direct, it's kind to be harsh, it's kind to be all those things. Those things are not opposed.
Well,
right?
What's the psalm? Then I knew his words were kind. I got to pull. You got to look up that psalm.
Yeah, I'll look it up. It's not resonating.
It's about somebody. It's in the Psalms where he's been corrected. And he said, and then I understood that his words were kind.
Yeah, because they've done this is always the thing, right? When somebody, like, if you really grasp, when somebody criticizes you, right? Like, our first response is to go, oh, I really hate that person. But the first response should be look for the truth in it, right? And maybe it was delivered poorly, maybe it was however, but still, like, then the person's done you a kindness. If they've pointed out a fault you didn't know about, that's a great kindness. Right?
Absolutely.
So that part is really important for us to grasp. Like, kindness is not opposed to, like, harshness or being direct, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to end. You've always been getting the last words. That's okay. It works out great. Well, because I also see him telling me that. We got a minute left.
I'm trying, though. But I see the eyes go.
So thanks, guys, for joining us. Father Ian Van Houston here with Rob Agnelli. We're talking about the 10 virtues of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Thanks.